Hello and welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thal, and I'm super excited to get into this week's study, not just because we're studying the scripture again, but also because in the last week we've gone from like 160 subscribers to now almost 600. Truth be told, it's all this growth has happened in the last 2 weeks. Went from like 40 to almost 600. So I want to just welcome on board all of those who have been subscribing in the last couple of weeks. If you're not familiar with who I am or what I do, I was a professor at the Trinity International University for 12 years until the university shut down its operations this past year in 2024. I taught counseling, psychology, and also Bible related courses. And so I started to just I've always had this ministry going on, or this service, whatever you want to call it, where I have my website and I had some podcasts put out. And if you see on YouTube there in the history and the playlist, you'll see stuff related to mental health and spiritual abuse in the church, and you'll even see some video game sessions. It was an idea I had with my daughter, just a way for us to kind of play video games together, and also talk about concepts related to mental health and spirituality, that kind of thing. And so I've always like kind of had an interest in it, but after the university closed, was kind of forced to figure out something to do with my time long term. Now I homeschool my daughter, so that keeps me busy. And actually, this whole thing works if we can get it going. In terms of just being able to continue to teach, is that's a passion of mine. I've always been teaching for a very long time, and for 12 years at the university level, and just before that at churches and stuff like that. And first time I delivered a sermon or got to speak somewhere, I was like 15 years old. It's been a long history of being able to not only open up God's word or the scriptures and to study them, but to also be able to share what the Spirit shares with me, and to be able to share that with those who are interested or those who want to learn. So that's a little bit about me. You can see, you can learn more about me if you go to my website. It's thyleThoughts.com. I'll have it down in the description for you to click on. I recently updated it and put all the podcasts on there and made sure that it had all the relevant social media links. So from there, you can click on social media links. You'll find on the very first page of the homepage, you'll find the links to various accounts like Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, TikTok, whatever it is that you can get onto. Go ahead and go there, subscribe, find a way to contact me. Let me know what you think about the podcast, what could be improved, questions you have. It's really something I want to get to. Also, is just any questions anybody has about the subject. I really like to, get a handle on those questions, have them submitted to me before I do the podcast, so I can spend some extra time studying them and answering them as we go on. So, again, I'm excited about the growth. I pray that the Father keeps opening up windows and doors through this whole building so that more can see light shining from it and are attracted to it, and will come in, those that He wants me to reach, and those that He wants me to minister to. So and to minister with, and to learn with, and to grow with. So it's not just about anybody who's watching; it's about me as well. I appreciate it. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and start up here with our study. It is this week's reading is from Exodus chapter 6, verses 2 through Exodus chapter 9, verse 35. Then we have Ezekiel 28:25 through 29:21, and Romans chapter 9, verses 14 through 33. Now, if you are just joining, you haven't gone back and watched any of the original videos, I mentioned before that these readings, you may be wondering, where do these readings come from? How do you get this schedule? I get these from the Lion and Lamb Ministries website. So it's lionandlambministries.org. You go on there, you click on Torah schedule, and you will get to, you'll navigate to Torah schedule, you navigate to a printable calendar or website, and you'll see their schedule for readings listed out, and they're ordered by Sabbath days. And so that's why you'll have a date. Like I don't have it here, but the date for this reading is 1/25/2024. Or sorry, 2025. And so these were the readings that were read. The what's called the Torah portion is, it's anything from the books of Moses. So we have from Genesis through Deuteronomy. the Torah portion's the first portion. It's the main portion that's from the book of Exodus this week, and then you have a Haftarah portion, which is just a portion from the prophets. And so usually the portions are related to each other in some kind of way. And what happens is throughout the world, in Jewish synagogues throughout the world, these are the passages that are studied. They have the set schedule, and they don't deviate from it. They read these passages, and then on the Sabbath when they gather together for synagogue, the rabbis are responsible for teaching, and then throughout the week they'll have Bible studies, and they'll have more content focused on these passages and these readings. The Messianic Jews, or the Messianic Jewish population, they follow the same schedule, but they add to it a portion from the New Testament, or the Brit Kadesh, which is just the New Testament. And it's this week is from Romans, and it's always there to balance out what's being taught in the synagogues in modern Judaism or traditional Judaism today, with a viewpoint of Yeshua being the Messiah. So that's where I've been doing these readings now for the last couple of years, and I've always had this kind of desire to share my thoughts about these readings. And it was just always a large undertaking. And if I'm teaching classes, and our classes were like 4 hours a week, and that's just a lot of work to prepare for just for that alone. So it was always hard for me to commit to it. But with the free time, with the work being gone now, so with the free time I have, or the time replaced from teaching, I could do this instead. And so I'm really enjoying it, getting into it more. And there's actually so much to talk about, and the podcast go on for like an hour, and maybe a little long-winded. I apologize for that, but I just always want to get to the main points of the story, and I'm going to work on getting narrowing it down. But that's where these readings come from, and the tradition of these readings go back to the time of Ezra. You can read about it in Nehemiah chapter 8. You see that Ezra had a desire, and then the other priests had a desire to teach the scriptures to the people as they returned from captivity, and so they started publicly reading it, and that tradition that Ezra started developed into this scheduled reading that existed even in the time of Jesus, when he said, "Hey, give me the scroll for this week." In Luke chapter 4, he was referring to the prophet, the Haftarah portion he wanted to read from Isaiah. He knew what portion was going to be given that week, and he came to the synagogue on that day to read that passage and to say, "Hey, today this has been fulfilled." So we see that in the New Testament, in the Gospels, as part of their culture, and it's just cool to kind of join in and to continue to read the Scripture and study it, and to view it through the lens of Yeshua being the Messiah. So we start with chapter 6 of the book of Exodus. In this chapter, if you've read it, and please read it. If you haven't read it, take a pause on the video and go ahead and read it at least once. I always suggest 3 times in different translations if possible. But hopefully you've read it. And so you might have noticed, you read this chapter 6. It's kind of like a repeat telling of what we've already heard. You have God coming to Moses at the beginning of chapter 6 to introduce himself. He's saying, "I am Adonai." That phrase Adonai that you see here, I use the Tree of Life version. It's a version that strives to hold closer to like the Jewish tradition in translating names and phrases and ideas. And so you'll see that in italics there, "I am Adonai," which translated in most Bibles is Lord. You'll have it in all caps. It's a reference to the name of God that we saw earlier, and we saw last week's study. "I am Adonai." I am who I am. I will be who I will be. That name, that concept, and so it's repeating some of that story. So when I was reading, I was looking at chapter 6. What I see is it's a kind of like an interlude. It's like the author's like resetting. Okay, we went through all this. Here's where Moses has this weird thing with Zipporah and the angel and the blood and the foreskin and all that, which we covered last week. Interesting passage. Well, we're getting past that. Now we're getting into the confrontation with Pharaoh, but before we get there, we're going to kind of retell the call of Moses and what it was that God wants Moses to do, and some other details. Now, there are some interesting theories about as to why this happens this way in the early books, especially in Exodus, that there were multiple sources that were kind of eventually put together at a time when the scriptures were being edited, and in all honesty, like there's evidence that that the scriptures were edited by people who, after the fact, like they got multiple stories or multiple documents, or they went ahead and they were rewriting the stories and they wanted to add some details in. There's evidence of that kind of stuff happening, especially later on with the book of, you have like Deuteronomy, and you have the First Kings and Second Kings, and parts of First Samuel. It's just the honest way of looking at how an ancient document can survive everything the people that it belongs to have gone through. I mean, there's going to be, rewritings, and not rewritings like they're just changing the story, but just like, hey, I've got to copy this over because we're not doing this digitally, we're not typing it up. And so I think just very practically, chapter six, you have chapters 1 through 5 was like a portion of the story that was there in a document, a scroll, or whatever. Everybody understood that, and then we're picking up in chapter 6 from maybe another document, and so it had its own intro to this whole scenario with Moses and God and Moses being called. And so the first part just had more details about the snake and the burning bush and the hand in the cloak, and just all the Zipporah detail, which is obviously like a odd one. Like, what's that about? And it makes sense if maybe later on someone cut that out because they're like, we don't really know what that means, or whatever it might be, right? And I'm not the kind of person who stresses so much on this kind of stuff because I'm not like I'm not the kind of person that worries that if we have any kind of questions about when things are written, whatever, that it invalidates the whole thing. I know that Jesus himself, Yeshua, referred to these scriptures as the scriptures of God. He says in John chapter 10 that they can't be broken. He quotes from the scriptures. He quotes from them as if they're from Moses himself. And so all I know is the way he treated scriptures, I can treat them well. He knows the truth about them. The more we study, the more we know, but still they're there and we can learn from them. And that's the most important thing. So that's, if you're wondering why is this story being retold, that's probably why. It's probably just another source that's now being brought in. Maybe it's a literary tool to kind of like, okay, reset the story, but I feel like we haven't gone that far into the story to need that kind of thing. Again, it's just God calling out to Abraham. I'm sorry, Moses, reminding or introducing himself, who he is. He's Adonai, he's Lord. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Yahweh, and then he tells him, I revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac as El Shaddai, but the name Adonai, they did not. I did not make myself known to them as. And that's an important part to look at just real quick. So that's verses 2 through 3. What does that mean? It's real simple that God clarifies that the patriarchs knew him as El Shaddai. So the name that a name that they had for him was El Shaddai. And what does that name mean? It means it's a combination of words. It's El is the Most High God, and so that's obvious, right? He's the Most High God, but and then Shaddai is a kind of combination of words meaning mountain and fertility. And so what I put down is like the Almighty who will provide, the Almighty who will provide, and I think that's the way it's used in the Book of Genesis. We just finished all the Book of Genesis, going back to October when the cycle starts, according to this the tradition started by Ezra around Rosh Hashanah. That's celebrated in October. But it's we've been studying through that and seeing the name and seeing how they related to God. I certainly think so. That's the best way to kind of understand El Shaddai, the Almighty who will provide. And so God is just, it's just retelling the story. Like they know me, they knew me as that God, or by that name, I should say. I'm still the same God. That's the God that they know me as. You're going to know me as a God that is I'm going to reveal myself to you over time, and you're going to see me in my power and in my actions. And so you're going to get to know me a little differently. He is still the God who provides. And we saw that, the blessings and the growth and how they've expanded in Egypt and Goshen with their sheep and their land, the fertility and the kids and everything else. And now we're going to see him. They're going to see him and experience him, and we are too, as we study it in a different way, in his power and in his might. And he's going to express that through a strong hand, as using this language to deliver them from the hand of Egypt. And so that's the rest of chapter 6, just retelling that, about the covenant. He remembers the covenant. He's going to hold on to the covenant. We've talked about that before as well. How it's God who stays faithful to his covenant despite human actions, or even the fact that Abraham is dead. It doesn't matter. God is still alive, and so it's up to him to not enact, but to keep faithful to that covenant that he made with Abram. And so it goes forward. It just retells that story. When we get to chapter 14, it starts over with this whole genealogy thing. What's the point of that? It's the point of this is just to get to the point at the end where we legitimize Moses and Aaron's position as God's mouthpiece and God's prophet. And so what the genealogy shows us is that they come from the house of Levi. And if you have been with me since the beginning, or at least the last few weeks, you know that I've been repeatedly saying how Jacob was not happy with Simeon and Levi for killing all the men of Shechem. He thought that that was an act of violence that went too far, that didn't have any remorse. It's all there in the way he spoke to them in the curses at the end of Genesis chapter 48, or at the end of Genesis, the book of Genesis might be chapter 49. And so it was clear that Jacob had a huge problem with Levi and what Levi had done. But when we get to this particular genealogy, we see here in verse 10 that Levi lived 137 years. And so if just remember that when you go past 120 in the context of the book of Genesis and the flood and that number 120, when you get past that number, you're looking at a life that God specifically has blessed and blessed abundantly. And so it's a formulaic number of someone whose legacy is one that we should recognize is a good one. It doesn't necessarily mean that that person is lived to exactly 137 years old. We have to understand the nuance here in the numbers and everything else. It's more about this person's legacy has. So let's say we take it literally. Levi lived 137 years. Well, connected to Genesis chapter 6 and the number 120, it tells us that Levi's life turned around, and that in God's view, Levi now lived a righteous life. Or maybe he repented or whatever after everything Jacob was upset about. And so that shows this blessing continuing on, and why Moses and Aaron are Levites, why they come from that tribe to be the ones that step up to be the leadership to take them out of Egypt. Because the order of birth was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Jacob blessed Judah to be the family with the scepter, the one with the throne, to be the leadership. That was Jacob did that. And so Judah, being the fourth son, was the one who received that, not Reuben, who was the firstborn, because Reuben tried to have his father's concubine, and so he was eliminated, or not eliminated, but he's lost as being the firstborn. His right is lost there, and you see that in the curses that Jacob assigns. Then Simeon and Levi, they both together did this thing to the town of Shechem, and so 1, 2, and 3 were supposedly kind of taken out of the running to be leaders to step up as leaders for the family. What the book of Exodus is telling us here in chapter 6, by giving us this new perspective on the genealogy, is letting us know that Levi, because he lived 137 years, that's supposed to tell us, like what I said, that there was change there, and that's why his son, or his descendants, I just say, Moses and Aaron, end up becoming taking on this role that God chooses them, or he chose Moses, he chooses Aaron, and Aaron, if you notice, Aaron's a little older than Moses, so God is choosing the second born, not the firstborn. It's a theme recurring from back from Genesis as well, and so that's why that's given at the end of chapter 1. And so chapter 1 then closes with a kind of a review of God's calling out to Moses about what he wants Moses to do. And Moses' response is, I'm of uncircumcised lips. So how would Pharaoh listen to me. And so just bringing up the insecurities. And so the previous section that we looked at, like chapter 3, Moses really was like, oh, but I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't speak or whatever. And in that passage, we read that God gets angry at Moses, like wrath flares up upon Moses. And then, then eventually the provision of Aaron is given. Not eventually, his wrath flares up. And then it says that he says, okay, isn't your brother Aaron there? Here, kind of like goes quickly over those details. It doesn't tell us about Moses. Like, it tells us that he doesn't want to do it, or that he doubts himself, I should say. But it doesn't tell the entire story that we saw in chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus that may be from a different source, right? Just kind of those ideas. So now we get to chapter 7, and we have this encounter between between God and this encounter between God and Moses continues. And this is where he appoints Aaron. So it ends chapter 1 with my lips, I'm not there. And then he's like, I'm going to give you Aaron. Tells him again the whole thing. And then in verse 6 says, Moses and Aaron did as Adonai commanded them. And what was interesting there was that that God said that Moses would be as God. So it says there in verse 1, see, I have set you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, will be your prophet. And so what the language is doing here, what we're trying to understand here is not that Moses is being made God. He said that Moses is getting the equal standing with God in terms of intercession. So what I'm trying to say is that for Moses, his relationship with Pharaoh is one as intercessor. So for Pharaoh to speak to God, he's going to have to speak to Moses. And then Moses will speak to God, and God will listen. And as we look at the stories here of there's 7 plagues, we're not going to go in depth at all of them, just kind of like the similarities there. But Moses will hear from Pharaoh, and Pharaoh will say something like, oh, please end this, and I'll let you go. And so Moses then goes and prays to God, and God listens to Moses, and God does what Moses asks on behalf of Pharaoh. And that's what that means there in chapter 7, verse 1. So if you read that and you're wondering, what does that mean? I've set you as God. It's just that Moses is that intercessor for Pharaoh. And so in that sense, he is like God. He can ask Moses something. Moses can then ask on his behalf to God himself. And then Aaron's going to be the one that's going to be the prophet. So what that means in reverse is that God is going to speak to Moses, give Moses a command, give Moses a word, give Moses instruction. Moses is going to say that to Aaron, and then Aaron's going to be the one to speak on the behalf of God. So in that sense, yeah, Moses is kind of like stepping into that place, because it's supposed to go God, prophet, people, prophet, God, or then people, priest, God, right? It kind of goes back through the priesthood and through the high priesthood as we go forward and as this whole thing gets established. But at this moment, it's God, Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, and then it'll go from Pharaoh, Moses, God. Aaron as a prophet doesn't have a role in playing in the message back from the people to God. So we move on from that, and then we have encounter number 1 in verse 8. So verse 8 tells us that God tells Moses, or it tells us the ages, where it said that Moses was younger. He's 80, Aaron is 83 in verse 7. So in verse 8 says God tells Moses to prove when Pharaoh speaks to you, he's going to say, prove yourselves with a miracle. In Robert Alter translation, he uses the word portent. And so what portent means is it's closer to miracle. Some other translations may say sign. What portent means is a combination of miraculous sign that shows the power of a being. A miraculous sign that shows the power of a being. So like with Superman, if you have Superman and he's like, how do I know that you're special? How do I know that you're important? How you're different? And Superman, goes and he picks up a bulldozer with his left hand, and he picks up a semi truck with his right hand, and with his foot he's balancing I don't know a bull. I already said bulldozer. Right? He's balancing something else that's heavier. This is why I'm used to having students and they help me out. They fill in the blanks for me. So he's doing that. It's like, oh wow, look. So there's a miraculous sign showing that he is Superman. What does it mean to be Superman? He's infinitely strong. Like that's one of the things that the that define who Superman is, right? It's a portent. It's a miraculous sign showing the character, nature, strength, or personality of a being. And so that's what God is saying here in verse 8. That's what the word there in Hebrew is saying is prove yourselves. It says, Pharaoh says, prove yourselves with a portent, prove yourselves with something that'll show me your power, your strength, your ability, your nature, something only you can do, only you can only mean as you. That's really important because that's the requirement he's asking of, or that's what God knows Pharaoh's going to ask for. And so when Pharaoh asks for that, what I want you to do is do something that his men can copy. And that doesn't really fit into the description of what a portent is, right? If God's like, I know what he's going to ask me for, something that his people can't do, or nobody can do, only I can do, something that shows who I am. So you'd think naturally, okay, God should just immediately jump to something that only he can do. And these people are going to be like, well, your God is God, and so we're going to let you go. But no, instead, we look at this verse says, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, so it becomes a serpent. And that's reminiscent of the first portion and what happens there with Moses. He does that and this turns into a serpent and he grabs it, he gets scared, runs away. God said, come back, grab it by the tail. He grabs it. Talked all about that last week. Here, he's doing this in front of Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh sees it. In verse 11, it says, Pharaoh called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they too, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. And there's like this whole mysterious thing. And with all of the plague, we're going to see it too. The Pharaoh and his men and the soothsayers, they have this magic ability. They can repeat what God has done. I don't know how to explain that. We certainly have magicians today. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody do such a thing, but they're people that can do tricks, definitely. But whatever it is, if they're actually doing magic, or if they were just doing like of the eye, a trick, or whatever, and they're just kind of fooling everybody. They're that good, David Blaine level good. Like if they're that good, then okay, that's what they were doing. Or otherwise, they're just doing the same kind of magic, and so it's not really so much of a portent, is it? Like it's miraculous, except for this one detail: the staff that came from Aaron that was, changed to a serpent by God's power, eats up the rest of them. So that does show something special. But in seeing that, it was enough for Pharaoh to say, "Nah." It says here, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He didn't listen to them, just as Adonai said. Now, we talked about the hardening of the heart last week. If you didn't watch that video, so you're wondering what that means. In the short of it is that God knows the heart in Hebrew is a phrase referring to like the character, the personality, the intentions, the thoughts, the will of a person, right? The very core of who we are. It's not just one thing, not just the feelings. It's so much more than that. It's pretty much the makeup of who we are. And so if you know the makeup of somebody and who they are, you know what to do to avoid making them angry. You know what to do to avoid making them upset or hurt, or even the kind of thing that if you say or ask a certain way will lead them to lie instead of telling you the truth. We know people intimately that way. We know them well enough, especially those we have long-term relationships with. We know what will get them, what will make them happy. Right? My daughter's birthday was yesterday. What would make her happy? What we could do to really cheer her up. Oh, the one thing is like no school. It's like, okay, no school. Like that's great. Like she's happy about that. You know people more intimately and deeply than others do, and you know what will trigger them, right? And with God, he knows Pharaoh's heart the same way. And God knows not only what Pharaoh's heart is like, but he knows exactly what it's going to take to get Pharaoh to let the people go. But God also knows, and we saw this last week, that in order to do that, though, his core personality of who he is, which ultimately is prideful and is a liar, is selfish, and is only looking at his own power, and thinks of himself as God. God sees all of that, and he says, I first got to make that as hard as possible. I got to make that concrete. So I'm going to do things in such a way where every little thing that happens, it's just going to make him become more and more like he actually is. He's not going to be able to pretend anymore that he's got any kind of goodness in him, that there's a piece of him that might repent or change. God is going to just continue to give him choice after choice after choice, where he knows because of his personality, he's going to choose the path that's going to make him confirm to God and to everybody else what God knows about him, that he's a man that's not going to let these people go. That's what that means, to harden the heart. And we're going to see that more of that in our Romans passage later on. Paul talks about that, and so we'll look at that in a second. Not in a second, but in later on as we move forward. So as that occurs, the 10 plagues then begin. If you notice from last week, the first plague is also similar to the third sign. So God had given Moses 3 signs to show the people of Israel who he is so that they could believe. The first 2 was serpent into staff, or staff into serpent, and then the hand and the cloak. And God had said, like, if they don't see those 2 and believe who I am, then I'll give you a third sign, and after that one they will know. So what's cool there is that God knows what's in the heart of the people of Israel. He knows what it's going to take for them to believe. And he starts off Pharaoh with the same test. Like, he gives Pharaoh the same first test that the people of Israel got, but it led to their belief in who God is. That God is who he says he is. For Pharaoh, it starts the process of his unbelief. And that's a point we're going to get back to later. Okay? But here, so the third of those tests that he never had to use, because they believed apparently after the second one, is to turn water into blood. And so that becomes the first plague. And so God straight up says it to Moses, like, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He's not going to let the people go. So in the morning, I want you to go out, and I want you to take your staff and stretch it out over the waters of Egypt, and everything's going to turn into blood. So they did that, right? And remember, so the order is going to stay the same. It's God to Moses, Moses to Aaron, Aaron to Pharaoh. Aaron speaks. Whatever Aaron has to say, whatever Aaron has to do, he's going to speak whatever Moses told him, whatever God told Moses. And then he's going to do as he's told. He does that. The water, everything in the Nile turns into blood. The fish die. You can imagine. It talks about the stink happens. And then, but in verse 22, the magicians of Egypt, they did the same with their own secret art. So Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Because again, he sees, he's like, well, my guys can do the same thing. This isn't like a special, miraculous, powerful sign that only your God can do. My God and my people can do that too. And so whatever, I'm not going to change. But notice also this, right? So if they are just kind of doing like David Blaine, like level tricks, right? And I don't want, like, David Blaine might be doing real stuff. I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying, let's say David Blaine was just doing like sleight of hand and tricks. Like, that's all that he's doing is those card tricks and stuff he does. If you know who that is, you can search him up on YouTube. He does some really crazy looking tricks with cards and other things that's just kind of like mind bending. How did he do that? Let's say he's on that level. These guys are on that level. So Pharaoh's like, okay, whatever. My guys can do that with their little tricks, so I'm not going to believe. But a common theme that's going to recur also is the fact that they can't undo what God did. So while they could replicate what God did, they can't undo it. And so you see here in verse 20, in verse 24, it says, so all the Egyptians dug around the river for the water to drink because they couldn't drink the water from the Nile. So they were able to do what God did. They got a bowl of water. That tells you where they get fresh water from. So basically, they had to dig away from the Nile. So it was the Nile itself that became like blood. But if you would dig into the areas where like the sources of the Nile would be flowing through under the ground, then they could find clean water. So that's where they would find clean water. That's how they did their trick. But it doesn't change for them because they can't undo what God has done. And that's a key point there to pay attention to. Maybe they can replicate it, but they can't undo it. They can't undo what God has done. Then after this, there's the next plague. It says that the river will swarm with frogs. The language is the same. God to Moses, Moses to Aaron. Aaron stretched out his hand, and the frogs come up, but in the magicians, it says in verse 3, did the same with their secret arts. The frogs also came up. So that means Pharaoh's not going to let him go. But then you see in verse 4, the first time where Pharaoh asks Moses to intercede for him on behalf of, intercede to God on his behalf. And so he says, pray to Adonai that he would take away the frogs for me and for my people. Then I'll let the people go so they may sacrifice to Adonai. And here's where God's like, okay, I know that Pharaoh is a liar. Right now, he's acting like he's just, no, I'm not going to let them go. But I know he's also a liar. And so I'm going to bring that fact out about his personality, about his heart. We're going to harden that up. We're going to show it. We're going to prove it. But there's no shadow of doubt. There's no one else who's going to be like, oh, I don't know if he lies. Maybe he gets caught up in the moment. You make excuses for people, right? So Pharaoh, it's like, for Pharaoh, this is the first time he says, like, I will let them go so they can go sacrifice to Adonai. And so Moses kind of gives him a warning. He's like, okay, we're going to do that. It'll happen tomorrow. And Pharaoh says, okay, let it happen according to your word. The frogs will go, and it'll only be in the Nile. So the frogs will just be in the Nile River, which presumably is still blood. I'm not sure exactly. And so in verse 8, Moses cries out to Adonai concerning the frogs. So he went out from Pharaoh, cries out to frogs. So he's interceding on Pharaoh's behalf. God listens, does according to the word of Moses, and then all the frogs die, and they have to pile them up, and it says it stinks. But, verse 11, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened in his heart, he did not listen to them, just as Adonai had said. So now the aspect of his nature where he will lie to get what he wants, lie to keep his power, lie to keep his position of authority, lie to keep the people under his boot as he oppresses them. It's just one of the tricks of the trade. It just shows again who he is and what he is, and lying is just one of those tricks that will help him maintain what he is and who he is. Okay? And this theme continues out. So the next thing we're going to have is the dust of the earth is going to become lice, and so the lice goes out, and again, this translation says gnats. Robert Alter said lice in verses 12 through 15. Either way, we have the same thing happening where the magician, it says the magician, now this is where we get a extra detail. It says that when the magicians attempted the same with their secret arts leading for that, it says they could not. So that's a bad translation. This is a Tree of Life version. I love it. But according to Alter, that translation should say that they what they tried to do and they couldn't do was undo it. So there's just like kind of like the language and just the kind of storytelling here. They were able to whether or not they were able to do it or not is kind of in question, but for sure what they were not able to do was undo it. All right, so just making that point there, verse 14 and 15, they say this is the finger of God, because now it's like not only maybe they can't do it, but they also can't do anything to undo it, and so they just like have this admission, hey, this is the finger of God, and Pharaoh at this point is like, yeah, I'm not going to let them go. So now God is showing, okay, even if I do something that for sure his men say, hey, listen, this is God who's doing this, it's not us, right? He is still going to say no. So he continues to harden his heart. He's just showing again his character, his true nature, who he is. It's not that God is making his heart hard. It's just God is allowing these steps to happen in a way so that his heart gets harder and harder. And we're going to see later at the end of the reading what God's reasoning for this is. So we're going to go ahead in the next plague, verses 16 onward, speaks of a horde. This is the first time that this horde. Now Alter says that a swarm of flies makes sense. It could be also, he uses horde because it implies like the word means mix in Hebrew. It's also the only time it's used. But he felt like maybe it could have been a mix of insects like flies and whatever else coming in, right? So it's not just the flies, but it could have been just flies, certainly. And so he says, so there's a swarm of flies come in, and it says, on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people are dwelling, except no swarm of flies will be there, no horde will be there. And what he's saying is, set apart. I'm going to sanctify. I'm going to set apart this particular piece of land to not go through what everybody else is going through. That's kind of, we're getting like this understanding of what that means as well, what it means to be sanctified and set apart, that the rest of the world is going on as it is, but this land of Goshen where these people are, that God is watching over, he is setting apart and he's sanctifying. And why? In verse 19, it says, I will make a distinction between my people, and by tomorrow this sign will happen. Now what's interesting is that Robert Alter, in his translation, the Hebrew Bible, he makes use of the word ransom. He says that you make a ransom for this thing to happen. In other words, God's going to make an atonement. He's going to pay a payment so that this thing can happen where their land will not be affected by the plague of the horde of flies or whatever it might be. And that's an important concept as well, because as we move forward, if you've read the scripture before, you know that at the end we're going to have the death of the firstborn. There's going to be a ransom payment, the blood of the lamb put on the doorpost. And so here we have the first time of seeing God sees this place as set apart. How does he set it apart? There's a ransom that has to be paid so that the people can be delivered from the judgment that's going around on the surrounding nation. As the flies come in and Pharaoh sees all that happening, Sarah's like, okay, go ahead and sacrifice to your God, but do it here. Don't go to the wilderness. And so Pharaoh definitely wants to avoid that, but Moses brings up the point and says, listen, what we sacrifice to God, your people see as an abomination. So if they see us doing that, then they may get upset, they may get angry, they may come and kill us. It's like, a few years back, I was in India, and we're Christians, so we will eat beef or whatever, and so we wanted to get beef to make beef curry, and I was in northern part of India, so there's the killing of cows and stuff is it's not done, it's sacred. And so my uncle was like, okay, we're going to get some beef. We got to go to the Muslim part of town. So we went to the Muslim part of town. There, they had butchers that would kill cows, and everything was covered with veils so that, Hindus don't even walk around in that area at all. But if they did, they wouldn't be able to see it. Right? It's an abomination to the Hindus to see the cows killed to be eaten and so the Muslims had to be very careful. Christians had to be very careful about where they do that, and if they do that, if it's designated in a place and it's hidden away and all that kind of stuff. And that's what Moses is saying here, because if the Hindus saw the Muslims killing cows in public areas or whatever, it's going to cause a huge trouble. They're gonna fight, and there's going to be problems. But for Moses and the Egyptians, the same kind of issue. He says they're going to see and they're going to get mad. It's an abomination. It's not going to be good. You need to let us leave the land so that we can do our sacrifice. The only thing I could connect to this idea of it being an abomination was at the end of Genesis. It tells us that the Egyptians abhorred, or they thought that shepherds were abominations. So maybe it's related to sheep itself. Maybe they think of sheep as animals that are abominations. I don't know. But the altar didn't really have much. He's like, by the time the Egyptians really, like later on, they kind of are okay with anything. So apparently there was a time where they had certain rules. So maybe they served a god or whatever that they thought they didn't have it. But definitely whatever it was that they wanted to sacrifice, which we see later will be a lamb. So maybe it's that. We know later in scriptures they do bulls and stuff like that. So I don't know. Whatever it is, they thought is an abomination. Moses says, let us go. Pharaoh's like, okay, fine, I'll let you go. So he asks God for the flies to go away. The flies go away. But then again, Pharaoh lies. It says, Adonai acted according to the word of Moses, reminded of the swarm of flies from Pharaoh and his servants and from his people. Nothing remained, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he would not let the people go. Then we are left with two more plagues, or three more. So plague number 5 is heavy pestilence on the flock. Again, Israel's livestock is set apart, but all of Egypt's pestilence and their livestock get sick with disease, and so they get destroyed. Well, they get destroyed, but they get sick and they die. And Pharaoh sees that the children of Israel's cattle and everything else was safe. That was verse 6 there, 7, and so he doesn't let them go. The next thing was dust from the furnace that comes out, and so that leads to boils in verses 8 to 12. it hurt so much that Pharaoh's people can't even stand in front of Moses. But again, Pharaoh's heart hardens, just like Adonai had said. And then finally, plague number 7 was hail. There's a warning. Okay, hail is going to come. Your livestock's going to get killed. If you care about your livestock, hide them. What's interesting is in verse 20. Normally I highlight this stuff, but I kind of forgot to. I was using my other Bible. So in verse 20, it says that those who feared the word of Adonai among the servants of Pharaoh, they went and put their cattle in the houses to protect them from the hail. But those who disregarded the word of Adonai left them in the field. That's an interesting added perspective. So now there's an extra warning given out to just the people of Egypt, like, hey, God's not going to ransom you or whatever in that sense, but here's an opportunity for you to save your animals and your livelihood or whatever. Just go ahead and put them inside. And so it's kind of like an act of faith, right? Like if I do that, it's going to prove that I believe and I fear God. And so some do that, some don't. The hail comes. Of course, their area is protected. It's not just hail; it's hail, lightning, and thunder, according to all the commentary that's given about the event. So it's a very intense and scary thing. And so Pharaoh's response is interesting. In verse 27, says, "I have sinned this time. Adonai is righteous, while I and my people are wicked. Pray, Adonai, that there's enough of God's thunder and hail, that there's been enough. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." And Moses said, "As soon as I go out, I'll stretch out my hand." So he goes out, he stretches his hand, everything stops. But he tells Pharaoh, I know, he's been saying this, I know you don't yet hear him. And so in verse 33, goes out, he prays, and the thunder stops. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen, just as Moses, as God had said. Right? And so with all of that said, we go into our Haftarah portion. I'm going to go ahead and close the Exodus portion. And we're going to look at our Haftarah. We're at the 46-minute mark. So yes, I think we'll wrap up within an hour and 10 minutes. So Ezekiel, the prophecy in Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 25, verse through 26 is a messianic, futuristic, eschatological prophecy. Okay, believers, Christians, most denominations call it the reign of Christ, the millennial reign, the 1,000-year reign, the feast of the Lamb, the wedding feast of the Lamb, all that kind of stuff. And then there are denominations that's not literal, all that kind of stuff. Okay, but let's first look at how the Jewish viewpoint of this is. The Jewish eschatology. Jewish eschatology was and is that at the end times, God in what's called the 8th day, the last day, when later on in the book of Ezekiel, there's this great prophecy and vision about the Jerusalem opening up and this river coming out and all the fresh water going into all the salt water and the world changing, God coming down, his throne being established. There's this whole eschatology is related to that. And this right here, it says, "When I have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they are scattered." We looked at a portion last week about how God's even going to sift them out of the dust, because even the northern kingdoms, the 10 tribes, everyone that was mixed up and lost into the nation of Assyria, it's hard to identify them as the nation of Israel. Like, where are they now? It's still, even now, the DNA testing stuff is incomplete. And there's a whole bunch of people that are of Israeli descent from the tribe of Jacob, and they have no idea because of how much they've been scattered and spread throughout. And so last week we looked at that portion in the Haftarah about how God's going to even sift that through and pull them all out. And so again, referencing to that idea that God's going to bring them all together, and then he's going to do that. He's going to gather, when I've done that and shown my holiness through them in the eyes of the nations, then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. For us that believe in the messianic prophecies being fulfilled by the person, the work of Yeshua, the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ, Yeshua, that the show my holiness through them in the eyes of the nation is his revelation, his second coming, by seeing him, the one whom they pierced in Zechariah is the prophecy there. They will see that, and there will be a remnant that will repent, and they will mourn for they had killed their Messiah, but that moment they will be redeemed and be forgiven, and then everyone will be gathered, the nations, and everybody's going to know, the whole world's going to know about God's holiness, and God's holiness is only seen through His Son and His perfect work on the cross. Verse 26 it says, "They will live safely there, and they will build houses and plant vineyards. They will live securely when I have executed judgments on all those around them and treated them with contempt, so they will know I am Adonai their God." And so that also is mentioned in the book of Zechariah, that when God, the Jewish eschatology says that when God's kingdom rests in Jerusalem, then it's going to be elevated up. So it's going to be like, nobody can just get to it. And then the festival of booths is going to be recognized, and that if the people of the world, the nations of the world, don't come to honor that festival, they don't send representatives, that God is going to then respond with consequences for them, holding back rain, bringing pestilence, disease. It's everything that you see happen here in Egypt with these plagues. And that's really what this is a reference to, right? It's like that time when they were just perfectly safe living in the midst of their enemy. Their enemy was dealing with all kinds of problems. They're going to be okay. And so for those of us who are believers in Yeshua as Gentiles, or as the Jewish people now who believe in Yeshua's or Messianic Jewish people and followers, going to be gathered into that place and be part of that nation, the remnant and the seed and everything else. And we're gonna see in Romans there that Paul talks about, we're gonna be dwelling together there securely and safely. Holy is the Lord. Our pots and bells and things will say, as said in the book of Zechariah. But the rest of the world is going to have to remain accountable for their obedience or faith, belief in God and doing what He said. And they're not going to be able to deny Him. They're going to see Him, but they will be able to say, no, we're not going to. And then God's going to deal with them directly, just like He did with Egypt here in the story of Exodus. So that's the end of chapter 28. Now, chapter 29 goes specifically into prophecies against Pharaoh. Now, here I did have the time to highlight, but I have my notes as well. Verse 1 tells us that it's the 12th day of the 10th month, the 10th year. Now, this is counting of the time of captivities. And so it's in January, and also Kings and everything related to the beginning of the book of Ezekiel. It's about January 7th, 587 BCE, when this prophecy comes to Ezekiel. It says, "Son of man, put your face against Pharaoh." So the prophecy is against Pharaoh. The context is that Pharaoh and Egypt will be left desolate and devastated. First of all, why? Because they have this idea in verse 3 says, "I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great crocodile lying in his rivers, who says the Nile is my own." So he's talking about that same pride that Pharaoh had in the book of Exodus. Now, in the time of Jacob's trouble, in the time of Judah being conquered and Nebuchadnezzar coming down, and even before that with Assyria and everything else, with Judah specifically, and with the Assyrians, and then later, they failed in their ability to take over, but then later you had Nebuchadnezzar coming. Judah went and asked for help from Egypt. They said, "We need help from you." Egypt said, "Sure, we're going to help. We'll help you. We'll help you." And that was actually something God warned them to do, and Moses taught them in the book of Deuteronomy: never go back to Egypt. Don't go get horses or whatever. No, never go back there. But they did. They were facing threats, and they thought, okay, we're going to go back there and get some help from Egypt. But starting with this position, Pharaoh is so proud. He thinks the Nile is his own, that he made it. What's interesting here is he calls Pharaoh the great crocodile. And in the story of the staff turning into a serpent, according to Robert Alter, the language actually can indicate not so much a snake, that it turned into a snake, that it turned into a crocodile or a reptilian-like animal. So it's kind of interesting perspective, right? That Moses would throw down, or Aaron would throw down the staff, and then the staff would turn into this crocodile, which would represent, Moses, Pharaoh, and his power and the strength of the Nile. We know today crocodiles still reign that area, right? So and they've got hippos to deal with, but there's crocodiles, and then they did the same thing, but they were smaller or whatever, but the Moses or Aaron's staff went and ate them all up, which crocodiles will do to children that aren't their own. This is just an interesting kind of connection there I thought of as I was studying this and looking at this and seeing Alter's notes. Either way, in this prophecy, he's likened to a crocodile. It says that he's going to get his hooks into him. He's going to pull him out. All the fish, all the other nations that are attached and feeding off of you, they're also going to be pulled out. I'm going to throw you in the desert. And when I leave you in the desert, you're going to be given as food for beasts of the earth and birds of the sky. Those are references throughout the prophetic literature to nations of the world and the conquering nations, and Daniel especially. So if you read Daniel, those images of the bear with the three ribs in his mouth and the lion and just the image of these beasts coming and the order that they came in and the great kingdoms of the past. And so you had like the Assyrians, you had the Babylonians, you had the Medes and the Persians, and then finally you had the Greeks, and then which is like a leopard fast, and you had the Romans, this iron beast that was so strong. And so what he's saying is that I'm going to pull you up out of your water, your place of protection, throw you into the sand, into the desert, and leave you there for the beasts that are going to come later and the birds of the air. And you can read Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and you see that context given, that he saw this big tree and birds in the air, and just this idea that the nations of the world are pictured in these different animals. For Egypt, it's water and crocodiles, the Nile. But their time of reign is over. God is saying He's going to pull them out of there, and not only because of your pride, but because in verse 6 it says in verse 7, why? Because that you were a staff of reed. So I said earlier, they made a deal. Judah's like, oh, you're going to come help us? Yeah, we'll come help you. And they did help one time, and Nebuchadnezzar went away. But then he came back, and they didn't come to help. And so he's like, your help is like a staff of reed. So imagine just a straw, kind of weak staff, and you lean on it, because they leaned on you. They thought that you would help them, and they took you by hand, and you broke, and then you look how the language is. You snapped, and you tore all their shoulders. So they leaned on you so hard, but you snapped, like your support just went away, and then it dislocated in your shoulders. Like, can you imagine leaning so hard on something and it broke, that your shoulders got dislocated, and then they tried to lean on you, and you broke, and you wrenched their hips. So not only did the shoulders dislocate, but the hips also dislocated. So there's total just pain and devastation caused by the fact that they trusted Egypt, and Egypt just their faith in Egypt was a bad idea. But then God says, I will bring a sword. And a sword is a specific reference to a specific person and leader. And in this case, it's Nebuchadnezzar. He's referred to as that sword. So it's the beast of the earth is the Babylonians. They're coming. That's the nation. The sword, the leader, the one who specifically is coming with the point to get you and get rid of you, is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. And so in verse 17, oh wait, so it says in verse 11. Oh, so yeah, I don't want to skip that. So it says their desolation will last for 40 years. It says there'll be no foot among you, the uninhabited. You'll be dispersed. And at the end of the 40 years, I will gather you back, and then they will come together and be a lowly kingdom. And so we know from history, and what's going to happen later in verse 17, which takes place about 16 years later, based on the timelines here, Nebuchadnezzar went up against Tyre, and he didn't get anything out of it. He had to like destroy the whole place, and it just didn't work out for him the way he wanted it. But he expended his army against them and everything. And Tyre was a place that was deserving of judgment because of its Assyria and related to taking down the northern kingdom. So God's like, okay, for your reward, basically, or your payment, reward, but payment for getting rid of Tyre and not getting anything out of it is going to be Egypt and all their spoils. And so I'll let you go ahead and read this passage with this information in your mind, because they're running out of time here. This is what happened historically. The Babylonians came down, they went through Judah, then they went to Egypt, they conquered Egypt. Then Egypt, for the next 2,500 years, until 1953, was occupied and ruled by different nations, including the Romans. And so this great power that they had, think about it, they were like this great power. They were the Babylonians before the Babylonians, the Assyrians before the Assyrians. They were the Romans before the Romans, the Greeks. They had their area, their domination, They had their slaves. They built great things. People are so obsessed about their pyramids and how they did that stuff. They were the height of civilization at that time. And because of their pride and because of their lying, which again Pharaoh had, lying and pride, God judges them so that they lose their place in the world, in their place of prominence. And it says 40 years there. What 40, again, earlier with the whole age number, the numbers, the number 40 is just a number about completion, a time of completion. Okay? But is it a literal 40 years? No, it's a literally it's 2,500 years, going from 571 BC if we take that as the beginning date till about 1953. It's like we're estimating it's about 2,500 years, so it's not 40 years, obviously, but it's symbolic. 40 years is symbolic of a time of completion. In this sense, a time of completion related to judgment, and so the judgment over Egypt. And what was the end of their judgment? That they would be gathered back, but they'd be a lowly nation, and that's what we see today. They're there, but are they what they used to be? Nope. It is they've been diminished. Like I said, I will diminish them. They'll no longer rule over the nations. They'll no longer be security for the house of Israel. And that's really God's point too. Is like I don't want my people to look at them for trust anymore, and they don't. They're like they have their issues going on with Israel and Egypt and borders and all this stuff, but they're not relying on Egypt at all for anything. And that's a fulfillment of that prophecy there. And that's how that closes. So we close out with Romans chapter 9. At any point, you need to pause. Obviously, you can. I hope everyone's taking freedom to do that. Romans chapter 9. We're looking at Paul. Paul is using the events of Pharaoh and Egypt and Moses and everything else to help the people understand what God is doing with Israel. In this case, at this time, after the coming of the Lord Jesus and of Yeshua and his testimony about himself, regarding himself and who he is, and even the signs he performed. And last week we said he didn't need to show signs, but he did, and they do show that he is who he said he was, but they continue to want more and more signs because of their unbelief, not because of any other reason. They just didn't believe. And so God is Paul is saying, like, how does this whole thing work? Is God not fair because he says he loved Jacob, but it doesn't seem like he's loving Jacob anymore, and he straight up just says, "No, listen, but listen, God, like Moses says, is going to show mercy on those he shows mercy, and he's going to have compassion on those who have compassion." And it says it doesn't depend on the one who wills or the one who strives, but on God who shows mercy. So in other words, remember I talked about earlier how God knows us. God knows our hearts. He knows which way we're going to go when things happen in our life. He knows that. And for some of us, when God puts things in our way, he knows it's going to lead to a place of mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. And for others, he knows that it's going to lead to a place of judgment. For Pharaoh, that's where it went, right? It went to uh, judgment. And so he says in verse 16, it doesn't depend on the person or who strives. It really just comes down to God's choice. Is there a way God could have humbled Pharaoh? Maybe, in a way, maybe. But his purpose, Pharaoh's purpose, was to be what's called a vessel of destruction. That's what he says in verse 17. He says, I raised you up to demonstrate my power in you. We skipped that. I was back in Exodus. God speaking to Pharaoh is like, I am doing this. I didn't wipe you out. I could have wiped you out. God said it back in Exodus in this week's portion. I could have wiped you out, but I wanted to keep you alive so that the people around you would know who I am. And that's what Paul's repeating here. The very purpose I raised you up, God speaking to Pharaoh, to demonstrate my power is in you so that my name might be proclaimed to all the earth. So then he has mercy on whom he wills and hardens whom he will. So it's just like straight up, it's up to God and his purposes. And certainly when the people were wandering around in Egypt or in the wilderness for 40 years, the main reason why people left them alone or were scared of them was because they heard how they left Egypt. They heard about all the stuff God did and what God did to Pharaoh. And they said, yeah, we don't want to mess with that God and those people. And so what Paul is saying is that right now, the Gentiles are the people that are receiving the compassion. The Jews, the Jewish people, the Israelites are the ones who aren't. Because every time they hear about Jesus, his death on the cross, their heart hardens. Every time they hear that, they harden and they harden. That's what he's saying here. Because, he likens it to clay talking back to a potter, like, why did you make me this way? He says, you don't do that. He says, does the potter have no right over the clay to make them the same lump, one vessel for honor and another one for common use? So then he asks this question, now, what if God, willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath designed for destruction? In other words, what if God, looking at this creation that keeps on saying, or these people, the nation of Israel, that's the context of these chapters in Romans, is the people of Israel and how they've turned against God and they've rejected the Messiah and what God's going to do with them, so on and so forth. So that's why I'm speaking this way. But he says, what if God, this nation now is designed for wrath and for destruction because they keep rejecting Yeshua and keep rejecting him, they keep rejecting him. But what if he also shows his glory on them as vessels of mercy? What if he did so to make known the riches of his glory on vessels of mercy? What if so in other words, what he's saying is, what if God is letting the people of Israel become vessels of wrath because they keep rejecting Yeshua, and so they keep falling upon judgment because of their rejection of the Messiah. What if he did that so that a whole other group could be the vessel of mercy? So the reverse, what he's saying is the reverse is happening. When they were in Egypt, God showed mercy to his people. They were the vessels of mercy so that people would see how he protected his people as he took them out of the wrath and destruction on everybody else. But now it's the opposite. It's his people are centralized and they're the ones that are the vessels of destruction. They're the ones that are experiencing the wrath because they've rejected the Messiah and Yeshua. Why? Because now everybody else, the people outside, are having their time to receive God's mercy. And that's going to happen to a point. It's not going to last forever. And that's Paul's conclusion here at the end, that it's not going to just end that way. He brings up the point of there being a remnant in Israel at the end of verse 27, and that God's gonna carry upon his word and finish it, and that's all referring back to the prophecies in the past. And then he's also going to that he's left a seed. It says, unless God, the God of armies, had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. So Paul is recognizing that there's going to be a time at the end, a remnant that's going to be rescued from all of this. But right now, it's the Gentiles who have the righteousness of faith. The Israelites they pursued a Torah of righteousness, means a teaching of righteousness, that we can teach you the ways to righteousness, and that doesn't work. They stumble and they stumble, and the thing that they stumble over is the stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, which we know is the great cornerstone. It's whoever believes in it's the Lord Jesus, it's Yeshua. He is that stone. He's that stone. So that's kind of the wrap up, the reason why this passage is given by the Messianics, for us to kind of see the people of Israel and see we're kind of in this reverse role now, where we are the ones, the Gentiles, being shown mercy. There is a remnant, a seed. Of course, there's the Messianics who provide readings like this and even commentaries to help understand these passages from their perspective. And then they're also there and they're witnessing and they're sharing the gospel, and that gospel is being given out and shared to the people in Israel. And there are people coming to know Yeshua as Messiah through their ministry, and it's a wonderful thing. God is calling his remnant out. He's pulling them out just as he promised he would. And so that's a great thing for us to look at and to see as hopeful for the future. Okay, and so before I just close out, I wanted to look at one last passage here in the book of Mark, Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, Jesus is talking about the fact that he's being judged, his disciples are being judged for not washing dishes and washing their hands like elders' traditions dictate that they should. And so Jesus quotes and he says, from the scriptures, that people honor me with their lips and their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. That's what we just saw in the book of Romans, right there. They have teachings towards righteousness, but their heart is far from God. And having left behind the commandment of God, you hold on to the tradition of men. And then I wanted to skip forward to a really well-known passage here. It says in Mark chapter 7, verse 18, are you then lacking understanding? Don't you grasp that whatever gives into the man cannot make him unholy, or goes into the man cannot make him unholy? For it does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach. And then it goes into the sewer, cleansing all food, as an aside. And he continued, it is what comes out of the man that makes the man unholy. For from within, out of the heart of men, come evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, foolishness, and all those evil things come from within and make the man unholy. And so I just wanted to bring that up and to also look, if you're still struggling with this idea of Pharaoh and hardening the hearts and what God is doing in vessels of mercy in the Romans passage, Jesus is just making it clear. God brings about situations in our lives, circumstances that come around us, come after us, come before us, um, and 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 what are they for? They're to show what comes out of us, what's already in us, because what's in us is what corrupts us. Is so if Pharaoh is being confronted with plague after plague, and his response is to harden his heart and to keep on to his pride and then to lie and then to hold on, renege from his lie, and then to continue to harden his heart and to say, no, you're my people, you belong to me. What God is showing is what's in the very depths of his heart. And what's in the very depths of his heart is just starting to pour out and pour out and pour out. And that's the hardening effect, because as that stuff pours out over the flesh, the stuff that's inside pours out over the flesh, it then settles around the flesh of the heart and becomes a heart of stone, a hardened heart. And so in your life, God is presenting you with opportunities and their situations and their circumstances, and what comes out of your heart is there. It's there already. And those are the things that defile you. And if you're not careful, as they continue to pour out of your heart, they will also turn your heart into stone, as what happened with Pharaoh. And that's just God's work in the world. That's just kind of like a summary of what he does. He gives Nebuchadnezzar kingdoms and nations and power, and he says, okay, what are you going to do with it, Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar's walking around, he's like, oh, I'm higher up than God. Boom, you're going to become an animal for 7 years. What makes us think we're any different? I'll tell you one thing, the idea that, oh, I believe in Jesus and he rose again, and he died on the cross, he rose again, like that's my faith and that's my belief and that's my righteousness. You can look at previous teachings on that. I'm going to link it up there as well, one back from November about faith being credited as righteousness. But if you continue to count on that one thing, but as circumstances come into your life and what comes out of your heart is what the Lord here describes, is evil intentions, sexual morality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness. There's no sign of the Spirit in your life. There's no change. There's no fruit. There's no love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control. There's none of that coming out. You have to wonder, like, what's going on with you? It's not about your salvation. I'm not trying to say you're not saved. Okay, let's say you're saved. But what is your life in this world for then? If when things happen to you and as you live and your circumstances go on, you look more like Pharaoh than you do like someone who belongs to God. You have to ask yourself that question. I ask myself that all the time. I'm so hard on myself. It starts with me. And I've seen a change in my life. I've seen a positive growth as I study the scriptures. I learn more about the importance of, man, what how I respond and what I do in this world, and that matters. Because I feel like in the past I was taught it doesn't matter. I can just ask for forgiveness and move on, and then I'm saved. So, well, if I'm saved, okay, that's great. I'm saved. But what about my life here on earth? Am I pleasing God? Does that matter to me if I'm pleasing Him? It does. I want my heart to pour out love and joy and peace and patience. I don't want it to grow out things that the Lord Jesus like is makes you unholy. I don't want to be caught up with the other vessels of wrath in the world. Like I don't want to be seen as one of them. I want to stand out, not stand out because I take a certain stance on political issues, but stand out because when I go to the store, I open the door for somebody. When I go to the store and I'm driving and someone wants to get in traffic, I slow down and let them in. That kind of stuff. Kind of stuff that sets you apart from the rest of the world. Like, oh, he's not a selfish, you know, a-hole type guy. He's actually kind of good and nice. Like, I wonder why. That's the kind of thing that gets people attracted to the concept, the idea of what you're trying to teach about Jesus and Yeshua. Because otherwise, how do you share the gospel? If you're a terrible person like everyone else and you're trying to share the gospel, ugh, I wouldn't believe it. If I got the gospel from someone like that, no. Thank God it was my mother who was a witness to me, and it was through her life and that seed that I grow and I come from, and so I'm really thankful for that. So anyway, I'm done. Thank you for watching. I pray again that this is just an encouragement to everyone. Please like, subscribe. You've been doing that. It's awesome. Share with those people that also are like you, like-minded. They like more serious, in-depth studies of Scripture. And again, please reach out to me with comments. I know sometimes I enable comments and it's just not like there, so I'm going to make sure I double check that once it posts. The comments have been enabled. Ask me questions, send me messages. Again, you can go to my website. It's going to be in the description, thialthoughts.com. There you can find links to my socials. You also see links to previous articles I've written, previous podcasts I've done, video podcasts on YouTube. They're also here on YouTube as well. Thank you again for watching. I pray for each and every one of you that God would use these teachings and these moments to push you in a direction where your heart is softened by the things of the Spirit, and so that your walk is by the Spirit and not by the flesh.